Welcome, everybody, to the second ever episode of The Right Side of Maybe, the podcast where we interview forecasters and talk to them about their background in forecasting, as well as some specific forecasts that they've made, their thinking behind them, and the ultimate result. Today, we are pleased to be joined by David Manheim. David received his PhD in public policy from the Pardee Rand Graduate School, focusing on risk analysis and decision theory. He has done work on a variety of grants and contracts related to research in existential risk mitigation, public health, computational modeling, and infectious disease epidemiology. He is also currently working as a lead researcher for One Day Sooner and doing work at the Foresight Institute. David is also a superforecaster working with Good Judgement Inc. and a top Metaculus forecaster, as well as an active member of the forecasting communities, both on Metaculus and on Twitter. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, David.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So, David, we brought you on to both talk about your background in forecasting as well as your specific experience forecasting COVID-19 vaccines. But before we get to that COVID vaccine forecast that you did and sort of dive deep into that, let's talk about your background in the forecasting space. Sort of how and when were you first introduced to this idea of quantified forecasting?
So I had definitely heard of the idea of forecasting and actually making predictions and taking that seriously. But the first time I was really introduced to the idea was when the Good Judgement project started, and they posted a bunch of places saying, "This looks really interesting. It's a geopolitical forecasting tournament," and I was in the process of getting ready to start graduate school in public policy and thought, well, this is relevant and interesting, and I have a bunch of free time because I'm not actually working right now and I'm not starting grad school. So I should do this. And I got started and got hooked.
And sort of what sold you on the concept with regards to public policy? Was it being able to sort of get a better sense of how policies might have an impact before you implement them as a way to sort of track existential risk? Like, what was that sort of catalyst and the sort of the core aspect of it that sold you on it?
Yeah. So usefulness of forecasting was, I think, is a really good point. It wasn't at all what I was interested in when I first got started. I thought it was kind of an interesting intellectual exercise, kind of a cool thing to do with my spare time. I think that especially the type of thing that Good Judgement was initially forecasting in the geopolitical realm, I don't think it was particularly actionable to anybody outside of maybe the U.S. government. But I think that it was interesting. I think more recently there's been a shift, a very welcome shift to making forecasts on things that have uh, concrete and important implications. And I think that COVID is certainly one of the places where that happened. But I think that it's um, that's it was always intended to be useful, but it only started being publicly useful, I think, after it was clear that it worked in the first place, after Good Judgment Project concluded that it was super effective.
So when you started to look at some of these good judgment questions, these geopolitical forecasting questions, did you sort of dive right in, or were there certain skills that you felt you needed to hone in order to forecast more accurately? Or even maybe that came after you did that first sort of forecasting tournament. You thought about, what like just some of the skills that you thought were important for a forecaster. Can you speak a bit about that
So
and sort of your process?
yeah, I think it was partially fortuitous that I had already read Kahneman and Tversky's book, and I actually had been assigned the more recent Thinking Fast and Slow book for, before I started grad school. It was one of the summer reading assignments for everyone. So I had been kind of thinking about those things for a while. I think that um, one of the things that I hadn't done initially, but ran into in the book, I believe, and also other places, was the idea of doing calibration training, where actually spending some time, and I think it's really critical and underappreciated, and really easy, but it's one of these things that most people can't actually tell you how likely things that they know a lot about are. So you ask somebody, hey, you drive to work every day? And they're like, yeah, every day. And you go, how long does it take you? And they say, oh, like 20 minutes. And you ask them, okay, so like, how likely is it that you get there in less than 20 minutes? And they'll say, oh, like, I don't know, 80%. And you're like, so 80% of the time you get there in less than the normal amount of time that it takes to get you there? And they're like, yeah, probably. Like, they have no like, they haven't even thought about it in a way that would let them make a claim about how likely it is. The question kind of strikes them as strange and unusual. You need to have some practice quantifying basic things before you get into actually trying to forecast.
And do you think that sort of that calibration is useful as that example you just gave, and sort of having being able to take your ideas of probabilities and being able to convert them into numbers? Or do you think it's also a useful way to sort of center your understanding on a subject? Meaning, is it useful just to have calibration training at large, or do you think there's also usefulness in calibrating yourself on specific questions? So if you're now going to forecast COVID, I'll take, I should probably do a little bit of calibration on what I know about epidemiology and public health.
Yeah, calibration is definitely somewhat domain specific. There's the easy example when you do calibration training and they ask you something like, how many goals did this football player or soccer player score in the World Cup in 1987? And I'm like, it might be 0. It's probably not more than like, I don't know, 15 or 20. Like, that seems like a really good upper bound. I don't know very much about soccer. I certainly don't know who this person is. So there's a place where you can say like, okay, like, I really have no idea. I need to have the ability to say, this is what a reasonable bound looks like if I really don't know anything about the subject. And then, I think that there are a lot of places where you have to have a pretty good grasp about how well you know the subject. I don't know that you need to do calibration training specific to each topic. I think that by the time you have a pretty good grasp of what it is and what it is you're good forecasting, you can probably make a pretty good guess about how good you will be in some domain that either you do or don't know anything about.
And then just quickly jumping off of that, how much time would you say that you spend calibrating and forecasting every week? And do you break it up? You might do a lot of forecasting on one question, a lot of work on one question, or do you try and break it up over a number of questions? One of our past guests talked about doing almost like speed chess on Metaculus and trying to just grind through a bunch of questions to sort of calibrate themselves. Or how does your breakdown look?
That's an interesting idea. I actually, most weeks I probably spend half an hour or so updating forecasts. Occasionally, I will spend a bunch more time than that when there are new questions that I want to really take a deep dive into. It probably takes me, for complicated questions, it can take me half an hour or 45 minutes to get to the point where I'm willing to make like a first guess, and then depending on how much I want to invest in it, you can spend all of your time working on your model if you really want to be forecasting a particular question very well. For the COVID questions, I was spending more time on it. When I was active doing forecasting Good Judgement project, I was probably spending 5 hours a week at least, kind of looking up things and thinking about it. Now I'm very busy with lots of other things, so I'm not actually spending that much time forecasting new things.
So building up on that, some great forecasters like Tom Liptay, who's another super forecaster like yourself, says that there's no way to accurately forecast complex problems without a serious time commitment. On a Twitter post, he wrote, "Making a good forecast on a complex topic takes time. Anyone who says otherwise is lying. It is not possible to thoroughly evaluate if Russia will invade Ukraine, if COVID is seasonal, what employment will be, etc. in 5 minutes." Other super forecasters, such as Peter Stamp, have taken similar positions. But as we were talking about just a few seconds ago with Peter Herford and his speed chest, some good forecasters encourage experience and calibration by just making a lot of forecast, which for some people would only be possible if they don't spend a lot of time on each question. So what do you think is a minimal time an ambitious forecaster should invest in their initial forecast of any forecasting question that is not super easy? What would it be for complex problems, and sort of how would you tell which forecasting problems is complex and which is a simple one?
So that's a good question. I think there are a couple of pieces here. So the first one is there's a tremendous difference between being able to do, I'll say, better than the average person at um, at forecasting something, and that's a very low bar to clarify. Like better than the average person is not like you're amazing at forecasting. And even for fairly complex problems, I think you can probably get a reasonable idea of base rates and throw out a number in 10 minutes. That's not going to get you a particularly amazingly well calibrated or particularly accurate number, but also I think, as Peter would say, right, but just the practice of going through and figuring out what the base rate should be and doing that is valuable. And I agree with him. But there's a difference between kind of figuring out how to think through things and trying to do your best on a particular question. And that gets me to, I think, the second part of my answer, which is there are lots of places where the best forecaster in the world and a mediocre forecaster just don't do that differently. I mean, the obvious example is something like you have a die and you're going to roll it, and you ask me what the probability is that you roll a 3, and I'll say it's about 1 in 6. And somebody who has taken high school probability should probably say the same thing. There's not a lot you're going to do with getting really great base rates. I think that if you were to ask something like, what's the probability that this dictator gets deposed this year? The answer is look at base rates and just go with that, and maybe you have some better insight, but you're probably going to do really well just picking base rates and going with that. But to do a really good job, you should probably figure out a lot more about the question and think through it much better. And that depends, how much effort you should put into a question depends on both how much, what the value of information is for looking into it more. For dice, it's really, really low. There's nothing you're going to do that'll change your mind. For some questions, it's incredibly high. What's the likelihood that this person will be reelected? And the answer is, I don't know when the election is, or who it is that's running, or if there's polling on it. Like you want to look into all of that before you start, saying anything. And at a certain point, then you should get to the point where it is, quickly diminishing returns, where you can't say a lot more that's really useful. So I think that, for complex questions, half an hour to an hour is kind of the bare minimum for coming up with something that's credible. The other thing that matters in this domain is how much do you care? And that seems like a strange question for a forecaster, because really, if you want to forecast well, the answer is you should care about your forecast because you want to do well forecasting. But practically, there's a big difference between I'm making a public forecast and I'm trying to do my best to improve my Breyer score, and I'm trying to guess how long it will take me to drive to work. And one of those, I just don't need to put very much time into. It doesn't make a huge difference unless I'm trying to figure out, am I going to be there in time for a critical meeting? So I think that that's the other piece. I think that people interested in getting into forecasting, definitely spend some time doing really basic forecasting, but also probably spend a little bit of time, some of your time diving deep and seeing what it's like to really do a great job, or trying to do a great job forecasting.
And when it comes towards spending that time, do you have sort of an idea on how that time should be spent. So a colleague of ours who helps us with this podcast, Mikhail Dabrowski, you'll know from the first episode, he actually helped us come up with the name, The Right Side of Maybe. He sort of came up with this idea of a minimal valuable forecast, which is defined as sort of enough effort being put into a forecast to be able to gain experience and calibration to improve your forecasting. So not only putting an effort to be more accurate, but putting in the effort to then take that forecast and be able to actually improve your overall forecasting capabilities. Do you have any sort of idea on what sort of steps and characteristics would be part of that concept of a minimal valuable forecast?
Yeah, so I think I really like the idea. I think that it's exactly right. I think that it's also critically dependent on the person forecasting. So for somebody who hasn't forecasted before, the um, the minimum viable forecast is just calibration training. Just figure out some basic things. It doesn't need to be about something that hasn't happened yet. Just spend some time getting to the point where you're good enough at this to be able to figure out what's happening in your head. When you say 50%, what does that mean? When you say 90, you're 90% certain. Does that mean that it's like it happens 70% of the time? Because if so, you need to change what it is that you say. So I think that at the beginning, that's where you need to focus. I think that as you get more comfortable with the basics, two things strike me as critical. The first one is when learning a new skill, you want feedback quickly. Forecasting something that's a decade off doesn't give you feedback about what it is, how well you do. And so I think that it's less valuable as a way of improving, other than just as a way to do deliberate practice. It can be perfectly good deliberate practice, but it's not going to get you feedback quickly. Forecasting a bunch of relatively simple questions is probably a really good way to get to the point where you have enough feedback so that you have some idea how confident you should be and what types of things change your mind about the forecast. So I think the step 2 after you do calibration training is try and forecast some things. Step 3 is probably reading what other forecasters have said in the comments after you've made your forecast and figuring out like, oh, did that change my mind? Have I figured out something that I didn't before? And then I think the step after that is trying to figure out where you would find information that would do that for yourself. So that's getting to the point where you're actually doing research to try and answer questions. And I think that's really valuable, but it's a step or two after getting to the point where you're doing an okay job. By the time you're comfortable forecasting, the minimum valuable forecast is going to be a pretty intense exercise in trying to figure out what types of information can give you useful marginal accuracy. I don't think that I gain a lot by scrolling through Metaculus and finding questions that I haven't answered yet and just like dashing off quick. I would probably make points. This is an issue with Metaculus's scoring. But I would probably make some points, but it's not a useful way for me to improve.
And where in that process do you think is writing out somewhere explicitly your thinking behind the forecast? Because I think, that is really useful in terms of being able to go back and understand your forecast so that you can sort of score it retrospectively as well. Does that sort of come once you're reading other people's comments on Metaculus? That's around the time when you should be doing it. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. Anytime you are getting feedback on how well you did, a record of what it is you were thinking when you made the guess is valuable. If you're making lots of kind of short-term forecasts to just get into the mode of being able to forecast things, then it's less critical just because what it is you were thinking is pretty straightforward. I think that the community estimate is a little bit too low, and then you look back and you say, "Oh, I was wrong. Why did I think that it was too low?" And you can kind of do that without lots of introspection. By the time you're saying, "I think that the community is discounting the statements of the CEO of SpaceX too much and is putting too much weight on the historical record. By the time you're actually going through and spending time thinking through the question, you should be writing it down, because even a couple of days later, you're unlikely to remember exactly what you were thinking. If you want to be able to improve, if you want to look back and figure out how well you did.
Awesome. So Clay, I mean, do you want to sort of introduce or get into now the meat of the episode, being the forecast that we wanted to have David come on here to talk about?
Yeah. So, David, you made a very interesting forecast for Good Judgement on COVID vaccines. When I believe the framing of the question is when the U.S. Would approve COVID vaccines, when they would go out of phase 3, be produced and ready for distribution. Is that?
I think it was when 25 million doses would be delivered, I think was the specific of an approved vaccine would be delivered.
Got it. So yeah, could you just provide a little bit of framing on what the options for the forecast was, how you made your initial forecast, and sort of what were the major factors that you were considering in terms of when the U.S. would be able to have produced and delivered 25 million vaccines?
Yeah. So to start, this was back in. This was, I guess, a year ago. They asked this question. So when it was still very unclear whether there would be a vaccine soon, which one, what the vaccine timelines looked like. There were a lot of people who said, vaccines take 5 years to develop. There's no way to do better than that. This is, we're in this for the long haul. And there was a lot of, there were a number of public statements by people in public health that I think, unfortunately, we found over the course of the pandemic, people in public health are very happy to be, let's say, poorly calibrated in the service of managing expectations. And so I think that there was a lot of caution from responsible public figures saying, this is going to take a while. Don't expect vaccines soon. And I don't know that it's completely unreasonable for somebody to have said that in a position like that, but also I think that it was misleading. Like I don't think that even they really thought that it would take that long. That said, the consensus was that this was going to be, maybe late 2021, maybe 2022. It was very unclear when they would actually be able to get vaccines made and delivered. And in the midst of a lot of skepticism, I thought people were being super conservative about what they thought the timeline would be, given the need to rush vaccines. Now, I'll say, I think I was right and wrong about different parts of this in, I think, mostly offsetting ways. I thought that the FDA would be much more willing to approve vaccines, given that things were like going really bad, that they would be willing to kind of stick their neck out a little bit. That was wrong. I also thought that the timelines would be shorter than I think most people were saying, but I didn't expect it to be quite as quick. If as we now know, the mRNA vaccines were designed 2 or 3 months before this question showed up, 3 months before this question showed up. So if we had realized how much of the work had already been done, I think I would have been even more optimistic. But essentially, my reasoning was that there were a lot of shots on goal, and there were close to 100 different vaccines that were under development during the course of 2020. Even at the beginning, it was clear that there were scores of vaccines that were being developed. And they were all in kind of try their best to do things as quickly as they possibly could mode. And people's references for their base rates, I think, were poorly conceived because they were looking at the problem not granularly enough. So in this case, you could ask, oh, what's the expected time from people starting work on a new vaccine to when it's finally approved? And the answer is, yeah, it's a long time. It's almost always a long time. That's a really good kind of piece of background information. But then if you start breaking it out, you realize which things slow down the process. And a lot of what slows down the process were all of the things that they were already saying very early on they were going to rush as much as possible. It was very clear in March that everybody was trying to push through combined phase 1 and phase 2 trials, that they were trying to there were a bunch of places that they parallelized the animal trials for efficacy with the initial safety trials in humans. Like, there was a lot of stuff that they were doing to actually make this happen as quickly as possible because there was a pandemic. And I think that using base rates kind of in a not granular way from a set of incidents that are not at all comparable was just misleading. I think that people weren't thinking through this. And I think that they were taking the pronouncements that people made, the responsible people's pronouncements, too seriously or too literally, I guess is the.
Yeah, so when you gave your initial forecast, it seems like you gave about an 85% chance that between October 2020 and September 2021 is when the 25 million doses would be delivered. Whereas on Good Judgment, it looks like they had about 85% being after October 2021 all the way into April 2022. That's where you sort of started off. Could you sort of talk to us about how you updated that forecast over time? What were the sort of significant events that you used to update your forecast? As you go through it, there are some questions that we have about some of the particular updates that you've made, because what's really interesting about your forecast is that in July, you said 95 roughly percent likelihood that between October and March, October 2020, March 2021 is when the 25 million doses would be delivered, which is of course what happened. But then things changed. So why don't you walk us through your updating process through this forecast?
Okay.
And just quickly also, if you could speak to where you got your information from. I think it's really interesting to hear you talk about what you were looking at and what you were sort of discarding. And I think that's a real useful sort of mental heuristic for forecasters.
Yeah. So the first thing I want to say, see, this is where I'd look better if I hadn't shared, what it is that I had said at different points in time. I could have just said at the beginning, I thought the right thing and it turned out exactly that way. I'm amazing. But it turns out that you guys asked me to pick a question to talk about, and it's not a fair sample. There are questions that I have bombed on. But you let me pick, so I picked something that I did well.
We'll just have you back on for those.
Oh well, I'm not giving you a list of things I predicted then. But my first initial estimate was based on my understanding of base rates and inside view. So I've found over time that I tend to be overly reliant on inside view. There's an interesting. I'll switch topics vastly and then get back to this quickly. There's an interesting theorem by Robert Aumann, the Aumann agreement theorem, which you may be familiar with, but it basically says that rational agents with unbounded computational resources and et cetera can't agree to disagree. So two people talking to one another who actually have enough time to go back and forth about why they think what they think um, should eventually end up really agreeing about everything. Um, that's not practically what happens. You do find people disagree, often for good reasons. Partially, when somebody makes a prediction that differs from mine, one of the reasons that I disagree is because I often think I'm just going to be a better forecaster than them at this. I'm going to do a good job. And if that's true, then I should not weight their opinion as highly as I weight my own. And when I'm working with a group of super forecasters, I should probably give their opinion some reasonable amount of weight because there are plenty of times where I'm wrong and they're right. So after my initial estimate, I started reading through and looking at what other people had said and what they thought. And I made arguments for why it is that I thought that they were too pessimistic, and they updated slightly on the basis of what it is that I said. And despite that, they were pretty comfortable with saying it would take a lot longer than I thought it would. So one of the things that I do to kind of correct for inside view is take some kind of weighted average of my estimate and the community mean. And by giving the community mean some non-trivial weight, I'm kind of insulating myself, my inside view from my overconfidence in kind of the internal model. I did that. I updated significantly to think that there was some weight on a much longer timeline. And then I waited to find more evidence. And there was a period where there was very little useful news about what the progress was. All of the vaccine, the internal vaccine development stuff was ongoing, but there wasn't a lot to say because companies aren't allowed to comment publicly about trials that are ongoing, and there wasn't a lot of news. This was also in my outside world when I started writing about an idea that I had for how it is that the government should start pouring massive amounts of money into vaccine development. And as I was writing about that and talking about that, the Gates Foundation showed up and said, yeah, we're actually going to do kind of that thing. They didn't end up doing it, but there were a lot of people who said, yeah, we're going to just start pouring money into vaccines. And as will probably not surprise very many people, pouring money on problems doesn't necessarily fix them, but it certainly removes lots of the obvious barriers. So there were lots of things that just made it really start getting clearer that there was going to be this really intense push. In the middle of the year, the discussion started getting more political about what would happen with the vaccines because President Trump was very interested in an October surprise, in a vaccine getting approved in October, and everybody saying President Trump saved all of our lives, we need to reelect him. It didn't happen that way, but there was a lot of push for a timeline, and the fact that he, among other things, the fact that he seemed to think, and his advisors more than him, but there were a lot of people who took seriously the idea that there might be announcements in October, made me think that, in fact, the timelines looked much better than people were still saying. And even then, there were a lot of people saying, well, yeah, but it's going to take a lot longer than we thought. And then, yeah, that's kind of takes us through mid-year.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting that you bring up the politics being infused in the vaccine process, because looking at your forecast, the biggest declines happen coincidentally, maybe or maybe not, after Operation Warp Speed is announced in May, you then dip your forecast. And when Operation Warp Speed announced of vaccine doses going out in January, and then July is when July into August, you have your big dip down from 95 all the way down to a low of 45 that the vaccine gets approved between October 2020 and March 2021, which is when there's sort of a new timeline for Operation Warp Speed that gets announced, which is having the vaccines ready at around the end of the year, with then distribution taking 3 months afterwards. And that's actually in retrospect, a pretty accurate timeline. 11 months from starting, would have had the first vaccine approved in December. I believe the first vaccine was approved around December, and distribution now, we're just reaching the point where supply is outstripping demand. So distribution took 4 months, 3.5 months instead of the 3 months that they stated, which was probably due to political actors getting distracted with other things in the meantime, maybe, or other factors. But it was still a pretty accurate forecast that came out around that time, which then coincides with your decline. Do you think that there was political bias going on, just too much noise around that time? It's just interesting in retrospect how your declines sort of happen at the same time when positive signals from the government were coming with regards to the vaccine.
So I think there are a couple of things here. The first one is everyone in the forecasting community, at least, took statements coming from the Trump administration with a grain of salt, is probably vastly understating it, but ignored things the Trump administration said. And I think that in many ways, this was a reasonable response to the fact that they had problems with honesty. But at the same time, I think that people were also thinking very strongly that because the responsible Democrats were saying that it was going to take a really long time, and the irresponsible Trump administration was saying it wouldn't take very long, that Trump was just going to be wrong and the Democrats were going to be right. And ignoring any other information about the question, which I think was where they failed, because there was plenty of external information about this, like what it is that the drug companies would say. And the drug companies had plenty of reason to be optimistic, but also plenty of reason not to make up timelines that didn't match what they thought was plausible, because investors don't really like it when companies make really optimistic projections that they then fail to meet. So I think that there was a lot of information there. The other piece of the political picture was questions about how distribution would be managed. And I think that there was concern that the vaccine would start being manufactured once they approved it. And by the way, this is what happened. You'd wait until a vaccine is approved and then you'd start manufacturing, because you're not going to throw a ton of money at making something that you don't know is going to be approved. And thankfully, the companies decided, without government backing for this, because the government didn't actually handle this well. But without government backing, they decided to produce tons of doses, even though if the doses had not been approved, the government wouldn't have paid them for it. The contracts that they signed were, the government said, we want to buy them if they're approved, which puts some kind of bad incentives on companies, but that's a different discussion. So there were lots of places where it was clear that they were starting to make the vaccines early. It was clear that the U.S. was going to get first dibs on the vaccines, despite the fact that there are very good equity arguments for why it is that the U.S. shouldn't have taken tons of doses. But what ended up happening was, that they got approved, basically in line with what the optimistic projections were. And distribution, and you said it took months for distribution to happen, for distribution to catch up to where it is the demand was. That's true, but also 25 million doses is nowhere near where demand was. Demand was way higher than that. They were going to hit, and towards the end, it was a little bit unclear exactly when they would pass the bar for having delivered enough vaccines. But yeah, it was, it a couple of shipment delays could have pushed it past the end. It's not completely impossible that some differences in how it is that shipping happened, or how it is that production happened, could have pushed it towards the next bin, happening in March instead of after March instead of in February.
And so, sort of continuing to look back at your forecast, I was wondering, what do you think some of the strongest aspects of your forecast were, in terms of, whether it's certain sources that you're looking at that other people were missing, or certain assumptions that you made that ended up being correct, and where do you think, your forecast could have used more work if you were to do it again? Things would have changed.
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that I got right early on was, as I said before, kind of properly breaking out the components of the question. One of the things that a lot of people discounted early on, that I highlighted, that I think I was exactly right on, was there's a real possibility in vaccine production or vaccine approval that something goes wrong and a vaccine is delayed or found to be unsafe. And that was a very real possibility, and happened with some of, there were some early stage trials of not the front runners where it turned out that it was unsafe, or it turned out that it didn't work as well as it needed to. The problem with looking at that is, when you have 70 candidates, very few of them are going to end up in a position where they get seriously delayed, or even if most of them get seriously delayed, it's incredibly unlikely that all of them do. And kind of the structure, the probabilistic structure of when you have 70 candidates running for something, is that some of them are going to make it through, even if the probability of any one of them doing well is relatively low. So I had said that very, very early on, I think in my initial forecast. The other thing that I think I got right was looking at what the different vaccines were doing and where they were in the trial process, because I think that there was a lot of discussion about how, well, the amount of time that it takes to do phase 3 trials is typically this long. After you finish phase 2, then and the reason why it happens the way that it does is disappointing but understandable. That most of the time you don't start planning your phase 3 trial until you're done with your phase 2 trial, and you have all of the data, and you've analyzed it, and you made a bunch of decisions on that on the basis of what it is you found in phase 2. Some of the issues with exactly what dosing level was used for vaccines in the phase 3 trial were because everything was moving really, really fast. In other scenarios, that would have been irresponsibly fast. Here it was exactly what was needed. But the point is, they moved really fast. They took not shortcuts, but they took no extra time to do the things that might have made it slightly easier or slightly more certain that they wouldn't waste money or time doing something that didn't pan out. So you could imagine that after the phase 2 trials, they launched the phase 3 trials, and then they look back at their phase 2 data and they realize, oh, wait, we need to do something different in our phase 3 trial. We have to scrap what we've done so far. And that would be very expensive, but also they would have done that. So there were a lot of places where I think they were moving quickly. The places that I got it wrong, so I said already, I thought that the FDA would be more reasonable about approving vaccines earlier, at least for emergency use in the highest risk populations. And they were not at all willing to do that. In fact, even after it was very obvious that they were safe and effective, the FDA took they worked hard, but they did not take any shortcuts at all in any of their validation processes to make sure that they had checked every box and filled out every form that they needed to. And that takes a lot of time. The other thing that I think I got that I didn't pay enough attention to that I think I should have, though also ended up not being a problem, is that the Russian and Chinese vaccines were ready super early and they started being used incredibly early. And it turns out that both of them were at least okay. We got a split between very good and kind of okay. But both of them are well over the bar that people placed originally for we needed to be at least 50% effective. And that was the bar everybody expected to need to pass. And it was only after you started seeing numbers in the 90% range that people said, well, so we need vaccines that are super effective. We can't go with something that's only marginally effective. So I think that I paid too little attention to the fact that there were vaccines that were going much, much faster. If things had been managed politically very differently, and this wasn't possible even at the beginning of the pandemic for lots of political reasons, but I wasn't paying enough attention to even have thought about the fact that I should have discounted this. Both the Russian and Chinese vaccines could have been mass produced anywhere. They are not RNA vaccines. They could, in fact, be produced by factories somewhere else pretty easily. That could have been kind of the answer. Politically, that would have been somewhere between impossible and laughable. But I think that that there was those dynamics that I wasn't really paying attention to.
Great. So now we want to just move on to a few sort of concluding questions that we have for you, and then at the end, tell everyone where they can find you and see more of what you do. What recommendations do you have for forecasters on a sort of very high level who want to be on the right side of maybe? Do you have books or skills to recommend? Traits when forecasting, such as maybe ignoring the median until you've made your forecast? Do you just have, meta level recommendations?
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is the gap between most people's forecasting ability and super forecasters is very wide. Most of that gap can be narrowed very quickly with very basic, kind of a very basic understanding. Really tricky, complex questions like this one are an unreasonable test, partially because the bins for when it would happen were picked based on kind of a fairly extensive amount of domain knowledge and thought. The people who put the questions together really thought about like what it is that the plausible ranges were, and did a pretty good job at picking bins that were reasonable. You could imagine somebody saying, will the vaccines be delivered in 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025? And like those would be the bins. And that would have been a much easier question. I think that doing a much better job is mostly about kind of those basic skills that I talked about before. In terms of recommendations for getting even better than that, I think that one of the best things to do is to jump in and participate, not just in forecasting, but in the conversations between forecasters. And it's a very open community. I think you guys are going to say that you can get in touch with me on Twitter. I talk about forecasting questions all the time. There are a lot of people who do that. The comment section on Metaculus is, for very active questions, is absolutely a gold mine of analysis. Reading through that is fantastic practice for figuring out how you should think about things. I think that the two things that I would highlight as absolutely critical things that people should be willing to think about. I saw a quote recently that I really liked. I'd much rather be wrong yesterday than be wrong tomorrow. You get to, if you want to be a good forecaster, you have to be really comfortable with getting things wrong and realizing you got things wrong and changing your mind, or at the very least afterwards figuring out what it is that you did wrong. So I think that's the most critical thing I would advise. There are tons of books that I think are perfectly good. I don't think that any of them are going to do nearly as much for people in terms of improving their forecasting skill as jumping in and getting engaged.
And then we're curious, do your forecasting skills and forecasting practices in general have any impact on your personal life? So, you brought up the example of forecasting time to get to work. I mean, do you really do these things on a day-to-day basis? And does it make it harder also to do it in your personal life versus these exogenous ideas?
So I'll answer another question first that I think is useful, which is, sure. What are my worst forecasting mistakes? Where have I done really badly? And the answer is things that I'm too personally invested in. Now, when I say too personally invested in, I don't mean how long it takes for me to get to work. Two places that I was horribly miscalibrated and just could not kind of shake my inside view and pay attention to other people's opinions and think through the issue clearly were Middle East politics. I'm currently living in Israel. Middle East politics are not one of those things that I kind of can easily sit back and think through. I've gotten slightly better at this. And the other one was I did some work while I was working in Good Judgement project. I also did some work on cryptocurrency related stuff at the Rand Corporation and had really strong inside views. And every prediction I made about crypto was horrible. I'm so happy that I wasn't actually putting money on these things, because I would have, I'm glad that I had food to put on the table while I was in grad school, because if I had been putting money on my crypto bets, I would have been in poverty. So I think it's really easy to find area, and I think that this is valuable. If you find an area you're really bad at forecasting, don't spend lots of time trying to nail that down. Admit that you're bad at that. Personal forecasts sometimes are in this area and sometimes are not. So there are places where I do not forecast things about aside from the fact that they're difficult to resolve. I don't forecast things about personal relationships, but I absolutely forecast things about what it is that's happening in my personal life, what it is that I'm going to be doing professionally, what it is that I could be doing. And part of the reason I do that is because I think it's good forecasting practice, but a lot of the reason I do that is because it's really valuable to try and sit back and dispassionately look at I'm working on these 3 projects. How impactful do I think they're going to be? And then, but no, really, how impactful do I think they're going to be? And then, oh, I'm working on these 3 projects. I should be working on these 2 projects, because one of these, best case, just isn't going to be that important or interesting or valuable. Or sometimes it's going to be really fun, so I don't mind that it's, there are reasons to do things that are not related to that. So I think that there's a lot of value in stepping back and thinking about that.
I know in Medium
I use for that is forecasting. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, I know on Medium that you post sort of all the forecasts that you make, including ones about your life. Have you noticed an accuracy difference between personal forecasts and let's say non-Middle East forecasts?
Um, it's a small sample. There's been like some variance, but it's not tremendously different. My forecasting ability in the types of personal things that I actually forecast hasn't been tremendously better or worse, though. Yeah, we could have a long discussion about the appropriateness of comparing Breyer scores across domains. You shouldn't is the short answer. So yeah, I do make personal forecasts. I do pay attention to them. But what I was going to say is um, it's the framing I use to think about what it is that I'm doing and how well I think it's going to turn out. Doing it as a forecast instead of, sitting down and talking it through with somebody else, or asking for feedback from a boss. Those are all valuable ways of doing kind of the same thing. I find this kind of fits my persona as a forecaster.
Great. Well, David, this has been a wonderful podcast episode. Thank you so much for all the time, all the answers, all the wisdom you've shared with us. Where can people find you, and what sort of projects are you working on right now?
Where can people find me? You can find me on Twitter more often than I probably should be there. David Manheim, at David Manheim. Spelled the same as my name, coincidentally. What other things am I working on? I'm working on a bunch of things related to post-COVID, what it is that needs to happen to reduce risks in the future, and some things about kind of long-term future of humanity and other types of risks that we need to be paying attention to. I think that there's a bit of a window of opportunity to use some of the reaction to COVID as a way to actually improve things about the way that people think about risks and prepare for them. So I'm working on a couple of things with a number of others, both in biosecurity and in systemic risks more generally.
Well,
Is that
I
the
hope
One
that
Day Sooner funded research? Sorry, the One
So,
Day Sooner funded research, the paper that you're working on.
One Day Sooner, yeah, One Day Sooner research is more closely focused on human challenge trials, which are one thing that should have been done, are now ongoing, should have been done much earlier. There was a lot of there was a lot of hesitancy to do challenge trials, despite the fact that they are a kind of bog standard research method that's been used for decades and decades with almost no kind of serious concerns about how they're used. I think lots of people hadn't heard of them before COVID, and were suddenly like, using human volunteers, that sounds horrible. Ignoring somehow the fact that all medical research uses, well, all applied clinical research kind of needs to use humans because that's who you're investigating. There are unique risks there, but yeah, so we're doing some work on assessing those risks and understanding the history of challenge trials and pushing for, if God forbid that this happens again in the relatively near future, it should not take us more than a year to decide that we should launch challenge trials. We could have had vaccines even faster.
Yeah, because they had the Moderna and Pfizer ready by end of January. That's when they had the first set it ready. And
I would have been indescribably happy to have been too pessimistic on this question. That would have been a wonderful thing for humanity.
Yeah.
And hopefully we invest in existential risk, because what is it? It's preventing a pandemic would have been like $48 billion a year over 10 years to do all the preparation beforehand, and now it's been $6 trillion in the US alone. But I'm sure next time we'll get it right.
I admire your confidence. I hope that we do.
All right, everyone, that was The Right Side of Maybe with David Manheim. Find him on Twitter at David Manheim. David, thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun.